My name is Eugene Qian. I work in Products and Network Division. My specific job scope is strategy planning in the Global Vessel Operation Department. So it's one of the probably mostly engaged departments in Ocean Network Express company. The challenge statement from our division is about how to intelligently digitize the systematic processing and recording of all the contracts that we have with the various external vendors. And hopefully we can have much better facility after we have the comprehensive database to help us conduct very in-depth analysis afterwards. As you know, ONE is one of the mega carriers in the world now. We are number 6 in the world. In order to maintain our service quality and also have timely negotiations with various vendors, we make a great point of striking best deals and timely deal with all the various vendors. Given the size and scope of ONE, we are seeing an increasing need to have a more intelligent way about how to digitize the processing and the recording our contracts with various vendors. So probably I will go to the slide number 2, which is a design that we intended for a better illustration of why this challenge is so complex, as well as the magnitude behind that. So ONE, as a company, we operate a fleet of about 220 ships and about 1.6 million TEUs in terms of nominal capacity, as well as 1.5 million containers across 120 countries. So you can easily imagine, the size and scope of our company. So several factors come into play to complicate the whole contract, smart reading of the contracts in this challenge statement. Number 1 is the number and the variety of our vendors. Simply put, we have hundreds of vendors across the world, and even for some vendors, they are international companies, but we have to deal with their independent entity in specific locations. So that will complicate the magnitude of the workload in this case. And that factor is further multiplied by the frequency of the contract renewals as well as the negotiations. Typically, we are looking at, depends on the nature of the contracts, we are looking at about 6 months to 1 year kind of frequency. And those two factors coming to the picture are further complicated by several other variables as well as the internal needs as well. Number 1 is that we don't have standardized contract terms and format, and most of the contracts, unfortunately, until today, they are unfortunately remain on paper, basically paper-based. And we are also lacking standardization in terms of wording even for similar terms or the same terms. And another very practical challenge that we are facing is the lack of universal language that is used to strike all the contracts across vendors in different asset segments and functional areas. So apart from those challenges and variables arising from our dealing with external vendors, we are also facing an increasing amount of a number of inquiries from our internal stakeholders about how we can deal with the big data in a much smarter way. So given all the observations that we have witnessed and experienced in reality, we are unfortunately seeing a reality that too much manual work involved in the whole process, and we are also hoping for a better rate of accuracy, as well as as long as we can produce and process data in a timely and accurate way, which will facilitate our subsequent deep analysis of big data. I think that will make more sense for O&E today, because we are triple size, as big as we are triple the size of any of the Japanese parent companies today. So on the next slide, we would like to bring you to the a very comprehensive end-to-end routing that we have designed for transportation of our laden and empty boxes. Of course, in reality, the routing for specific shipments and empty repositioning may be different, meaning that much shorter than what you see from the slide here. But in order to have a better vision of how many types and what are the scopes of the external vendors, we have designed this end-to-end comprehensive routing. So in a typical way, laden and empty boxes will probably be picked up from some inland container depot or dry ports, and via rail or truck, those laden and empty boxes will be transported to some gateway ports, seaports for export. Before those boxes arrive at the destination ports, probably 1 or 2 transshipments will be involved. So in order to deliver that transshipment service, we probably have to engage some feed operator as well. So after those boxes arrive at the destination, some of them will probably have to be hauled all the way into some inland depot or container dry port. Depends on the contracts or the business needs that we have in reality. So all in all, although this comprehensive routing is only reflecting one aspect of the entire business that O&E is dealing, we can easily take away the types of the main vendors that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, which include the depot operators in the inland locations, the terminal operators, the feed operators, the rail haulage service providers, as well as the truckers. So in the next 2 slides, I will touch on some examples about why we say this pinpoint is so stubborn at this moment, and how eager we are to get a more intelligent solution for our to address this in our reality. So on the side of external vendors, as we mentioned before, so we have several aspects that we have to consider. Number one is there's no standardized format for contracts or the terms with external vendors, and many of them remain paper-based. So in this small example that we listed here, as you can see from the slides on the right, on the left-hand side, is that even for 2 terminals operating in the same port, we may face a situation where the sequences of the clauses of those individual contracts, as well as the inclusiveness of those clauses, may vary from each other. And when it comes to the lack of standardization in wording for similar terms or same terms, I think this example that we use here is very illustrative. This is one of the most common terms that we face when we strike contracts with terminal operators in particular. Exclusivity clause. So in Terminal A's contract, as you can see from the small example there, it is much more concise than the Terminal B's contracts in the similar area. However, if you read the sentence there, you'll probably feel that the potential legal flexibility or room to interpret this clause otherwise will be much more strict than what we can take away from the clause that we see in the contract with the Terminal B operator, meaning that in Terminal B's contracts, the clause says customer endeavors to deploy services to Terminal B, although with a much more specified scope, geographical scope in this area. So you can see it's not only one contract is more strict or more comprehensive than the other, but the reality may point to a mixed picture in our business dealing with terminal operators. As to the fact that there's no universal language for us to strike contracts across regions and locations with our vendors, when it comes to the shortage of or lack of universal language for contracting with various vendors, I think China is a great example. It's a huge market for both import and export nowadays. But when we deal with, for example, terminal operators in Chinese seaports, the most preferred original language for the contracts is, inevitably Chinese still. But of course, in many cases, they will provide English version. But in the event of any legal disputes, the original version of the contract, which is written in Chinese, will be used. So in that sense, that we have to precisely interpret and process the meanings of those clauses in the original version of contracts when we deal with Chinese vendors. So last but not least, I would like to touch on the increasing number of internal requirements from O&E. This is more critical, I think, given O&E's size and scope when we are accumulating tremendous amounts of big data. Because if you don't conduct in-depth analysis, those big data pretty much will become meaningless. So we have listed up some typical examples of those internal requirements or inquiries in terms of how to use those contract terms and how to make sense of them. Number one, for example, how to get precise basics of contracts, of one contract, including the validity periods, from to, and what is it extendable or not? Are we in the extendable period or not? So when it comes to the one typical contract with terminal operators, we have to interpret things like incentive scheme, like rebate scheme. What is the scheme entailing? Meaning that, for example, the discounted rate starts from the first TU of the entire throughput of O&E with that vendor, or from the first TU from that band. And in the middle of the year or some time of the year, where are we in terms of meeting this incentive volume for the throughput? And when we have influx of containers in certain ports, we also have to consider and precisely interpret what are the specific fee pool terms at concerned ports, especially in adjacent areas, so that we can make best use of those terms with different vendors in the interest of O&E. Next one will be, when we design routing for laden or empty containers, as I mentioned it before in the comprehensive end-to-end routing, sometimes adding feeder may make more economic sense for O&E rather than direct transportation. But how can we make a right judgment call? So we have to make sure that the right data are being extracted in the first place and recorded and processed in our system from various contracts, for example, with feed operators, with terminal operators, etc., etc. And as I used in the previous example, how to interpret the implications of exclusivity clauses with different terminal operators in the same region or in the very adjacent area. So all those are very typical and pressing questions that we receive on a day-to-day basis, and at the same time we are receiving even more of them when we grow our business as O&E. So given all the reality that we have, we are very keen to find an effective solution and a very intelligent one, about how we can read our contracts in a smart and precise way, so that we can conduct our timely in-depth analysis afterwards. Thank you very much.